The table had been set since 2 in the afternoon. My mother had been up since 6, and I know that because she called me at 6:15 to ask whether my husband preferred his sweet potatoes with brown sugar or maple syrup. And I had to pause for a moment and think about it, which made her laugh. She said it didn't matter. She made both. That was the kind of woman she was. That was the kind of Thanksgiving it was supposed to be. My brother had driven up from Philadelphia. He'd made good time, he said, when he came through the door, dropping his bag by the coat rack and pulling my mother into a hug that lifted her slightly off the floor. She made that little noise she always made, half protest, half delight. My father shook his hand and then pulled him in anyway. They were like that with him. They had always been like that with him. I watched from the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over my shoulder, and I felt the particular warmth of it. The specific, uncomplicated pleasure of watching your family be happy in the same room. My husband was at the counter slicing bread. He'd been folding himself into my family's traditions for 3 years now, and he was good at it, genuinely good. Not in the effortful way of someone trying to be liked, but in the easy way of someone who actually paid attention to people. He noticed things. It was part of what he did for work. He was a licensed fraud examiner, had been for 8 years, mostly corporate cases, insurance claims, financial audits for companies that suspected something was wrong and needed someone to find out what. He said the job had ruined him for small talk but sharpened him for everything else. I believed him. I had seen him walk into a room and quietly catalog it in a way that most people never noticed. He noticed things. My brother set his jacket over the back of a chair and started telling a story about the drive. About a near miss on the turnpike involving a pickup truck and what he described as a deeply optimistic lane change, and everyone laughed and the kitchen smelled like sweet potatoes and rosemary. And my mother said dinner would be ready in 40 minutes, and for a little while everything was exactly what it looked like. My brother's name, what I called him, what I'd always called him, which I'd always called him, was just my brother. 4 years older, the one who'd gone to medical school. The one who'd finished his residency and joined a practice out in Scottsdale, or so we had all understood for the past several years. Pediatrics. He was good with kids, had always been good with kids, patient in a way that didn't seem performed. My parents had talked about it at every holiday since he graduated. Talked about it with neighbors, with people from their church, with my aunt in Columbus who brought it up unprompted at every family gathering, as though she had been personally involved in his acceptance. He was the thing they were most proud of, and they were not quiet about it, and he had never seemed to mind. He sat down at the table when my mother called us in, and he poured water for everyone before pouring his own. And he asked my father about the gutters he'd been meaning to fix since September, and he asked me about the nonprofit I'd just started working for, and he was warm and present, and exactly himself. My husband watched him the way he watched most things. Quietly. We were somewhere in the middle of dinner. My father had just started a story about a coworker that he'd been working up to for at least 20 minutes, when my husband leaned toward me slightly and said, low enough that only I could hear, has he mentioned which hospital group he's with now? I looked at him. His eyes were still on my father, who was still talking. What? I said. The practice in Scottsdale. Has he said which group he's affiliated with? I thought about it. I don't think so. Why? My husband said nothing for a moment. Then, ask him tonight. Casually. I'm curious. I started to say something else, but my father had reached the punchline of his story, and the table laughed, and my mother stood up to get the cranberry sauce she'd forgotten, and the moment passed. But I kept it with me. It sat in the back of my thoughts for the rest of the meal like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream, small, visible, hard to ignore once you had noticed it. I did not ask my brother that night. I almost did twice, once when he was helping me clear the plates, and once when we were all watching football and he made a comment about a player who'd had a shoulder injury, something precise about recovery time, something that sounded like someone who knew. But both times the moment closed before I could fit the question in naturally, and I told myself it was fine. I could ask later. It wasn't urgent. My husband was quiet on the drive home, not withdrawn. He answered when I talked, responded fully, asked about whether I thought my mother had seemed more tired than usual, but there was a quality to his quiet that I recognized. Focused. the way he got when something was pulling at him. I waited until we were home, until we were in the kitchen making tea, before I said, "What was that tonight? About the hospital group?" He leaned against the counter. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at me. "Did he ever tell you what his license number was?" I stared at him. Why would he tell me his license number? Most physicians I've met mention it at some point. Not directly, but it comes up. Insurance, credentialing, paperwork. It's just part of their daily vocabulary. He's never mentioned anything like that with you? I thought back over years of dinners, holidays, phone calls. "No," I said. "But that doesn't mean anything. We don't really talk about work in specifics." "Okay," he said. "What about the practice name? You said Scottsdale." "That's what he told us. That's always been what he said. Has anyone ever looked it up, called, sent him anything at that address?" I opened my mouth and then closed it. My parents sent Christmas cards every year to an address in Scottsdale. Had for years. Cards came back, not a return to sender, not an error. Someone received them. Or at least they hadn't come back. I said, "You think something's wrong." He was quiet for a moment. Not the way people are quiet when they don't know what to say, but the way he was quiet when he was choosing between things. "I think there are some things that don't quite line up," he said. "And I might be wrong. I want to be wrong." "Like what?" He said the questions carefully, the way he did with everything. He'd been doing this long enough to know that what felt like certainty at the beginning of a case almost never was. The thing about my brother's residency, he said, the timeline didn't fit exactly right. My brother had started medical school at 23. He'd told us his residency was 3 years, pediatrics. But pediatric residencies were typically 3 years after completing medical school, and medical school was 4 years minimum. And he mentioned during one holiday that he'd taken an extra year after his second year because of what he described as a health issue he'd resolved. That would make it closer to 8 or 9 years total before he was practicing. But the timeline we'd all been given placed him in his own practice at 31. The math, my husband said quietly, was tight. Not impossible, but tight enough to notice. The other thing was smaller. Earlier in the evening, my brother had used a phrase, something about how he handled a particular kind of conflict with parents of young patients, a specific technique for delivering bad news. It was a real thing, my husband said, an actual framework that existed, but the way he described it was a little off, like someone who'd read about it rather than trained in it, which could mean nothing. Physicians misremembered terminology all the time. He wasn't saying it meant something, but, I said, "But I'd spent 8 years learning to tell the difference between a mistake and a gap," he said, "and some of what I heard tonight felt like a gap." I sat down on the kitchen stool. The tea was getting cold. Outside, a car moved down the street, and its headlights made a slow arc across the wall, and then it was dark again. I said, "If you're right. If there's something, what could it even be?" He looked at me carefully. "I don't know. Could be a lot of things. Could be nothing. Could be that he left medicine at some point and didn't know how to tell your family. Could be something else." He paused. "I don't want to speculate ahead of what I actually know. But I think someone should know enough to ask." I didn't sleep well that night. I lay there and thought about my brother. Really, thought about him, the way you don't usually let yourself think about people you love. Went through what I actually knew versus what I had been told. Went through his calls home, which were warm and detailed, but, now that I was paying attention, almost never specific. He talked about patients in general terms. He talked about the office, the drive, the weather in Arizona. He never mentioned a colleague by name. Never mentioned a billing issue, a licensing renewal, a conference he was attending. Never mentioned a colleague's wedding or a difficult week on call or any of the particular texture of a working life. I had taken all of that for privacy. He had always been private. It had seemed like a quality, not a symptom. I called him 2 days after Thanksgiving, on a Saturday morning when I knew he would be home. I asked how the drive back had been. We talked about our parents for a while, about my father's gutters, about whether my mother would actually go to that yoga class she'd been talking about since July. And then, with my heart doing something uncomfortable, I said, "Hey, what's the name of the practice again? I have a friend who just moved to Scottsdale and I thought I'd pass your name along." There was a pause. Not long. Not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer. more like the pause of someone who was deciding something. "Oh," he said. "Yeah, actually, I'm not at that practice anymore. I made a change a while back. I'm at a different group now." "What group?" I said. Another pause. "It's in transition, actually. Kind of complicated right now. I'll let you know when it's settled." I said okay. I said of course. I asked if everything was all right and he said yes. Just some paperwork, nothing to worry about. We talked for another 10 minutes and said goodbye, and I sat on my couch with the phone still in my hand. I told my husband that evening. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That's what I needed to hear." "What does it mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "that there's something there to find, a practice that's in transition, a change he made a while back that he hasn't mentioned to your family, an address he's been receiving cards at that apparently isn't a place he works anymore." He looked at me. "It might still be something minor. It might not be. What do I do? That depends on what you want," he said. "I can look further. I have access to professional licensing databases. If he's licensed in Arizona, it'll show up. If he's not," he stopped. "If he's not, that's a different conversation." I thought about my mother standing at the stove that morning at 6 a.m., making 2 versions of sweet potatoes because she wanted to make sure my husband felt at home. I thought about my father's face when my brother walked through the door. I thought about my aunt in Columbus who brought it up at every family gathering. "Look," I said. He looked. My brother held no active medical license in the state of Arizona. He held no active medical license in any state. The National Practitioner Databank had no record of him. The medical school he had named, the one my parents had attended graduation at, had taken photos in front of, still had framed on the wall of their living room, had conferred a degree on someone with his name, but the graduation date matched a year he had told us he was in his residency. My husband sat with me while I looked at all of it, or rather, while I watched him look at it and explain it to me quietly, piece by piece. He didn't editorialize. He didn't tell me what it meant about my brother as a person. He just showed me what was there and what wasn't. What was there? A degree, completed. The real kind. He had finished medical school. That part was true. What wasn't there? Any record of a completed residency? Any active license? Any affiliated practice? Any trail of a working physician, because he had never become one? What was there instead? A name on a lease in Phoenix. A job history that my husband found through a professional background service logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company, then operations manager for a medical supply firm, which I suppose was as close as he had gotten. Steady work, real work. Work he had apparently been doing under his own name for the better part of a decade while we all believed he was saving children's lives in Scottsdale. I cried for a long time that night. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger. Mostly out of something harder to name. Grief, maybe. For the years of it. For every holiday where he had sat at that table and listened to my parents talk about him with a pride that must have landed on him like something heavy. For whatever it had cost him to keep that face in place, year after year after year, while the truth of his life waited in a city 4 states away. I thought about the question I hadn't asked yet, why? Not the logistics of why I could piece those together. He had finished medical school and then, for whatever reason, hadn't matched into a residency, or hadn't completed one, or had stepped back, and instead of telling his family, had let the story keep going. That part made a terrible kind of sense to me, even through the hurt. The first lie was probably small, just buying time. And then the time kept going and the story had to keep going with it, and at some point it had been so long that the truth had become almost impossible to say. What I didn't understand yet was what he had actually wanted. I called him on a Tuesday evening. I didn't tell him I was calling to say anything specific. I just called and let the conversation find its way there, the way conversations sometimes do when both people are carrying the same thing. We had been talking for maybe 15 minutes when he said, out of nowhere, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," I said. "Have you ever felt like something you didn't do just kept going? Like a train you weren't on anymore, but everyone thought you were still on?" I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. He didn't say anything. "I found some things," I said. "My husband found some things. I didn't go looking to hurt you. I want you to know that. The silence was long, long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then he said, "How much?" "Enough," I said. "I know you finished school. I know you didn't finish the rest." He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was different, not smaller exactly, but the surface of it was gone. The version of himself he used at holidays, the easy warmth, the good story about the drive that was gone, and what was underneath was just him, tired and real. "I matched," he said. "I want you to know that because I think it matters. I matched into a residency in my second choice specialty, and I went, and I lasted 4 months. He told me what those 4 months had been like, the hours, which I had known about in the abstract, the specific kind of exhaustion that didn't resolve with sleep, the way he had started to understand, slowly and then all at once, that he wasn't going to be able to do it. Not because he wasn't smart enough, not because he didn't care, but because something in the machinery of it broke him down in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't fix. He had gone into medicine because our parents had believed he was meant for it, and because he had believed them, and because he was good at the studying and the tests and the parts that came before you were actually inside the thing. But the actual thing, the daily living reality of it, had not been what either of them had imagined. He had left in November of that year. He had told my parents he was transitioning between programs. He had told them the new program started in January. January came, and there was a new story, and then another one, and the stories had accumulated the way debt accumulates when you don't look at it quietly, steadily, until it's enormous. "I kept thinking I'd go back," he said. "That's the part I need you to understand. For the first 2 years, I really believed I was going to figure it out and go back. And then at some point, I wasn't thinking about going back anymore. I was just thinking about how to keep the story going. And those are not the same thing. I know that. Did you ever think about just telling them?" He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Every Christmas," he said. "Every single one. I would sit at that table and think, this is the year I'll say something after dinner. I'll find a way to start. And then Dad would say something about a kid at his office whose son had just gotten into medical school, and Mom would put her hand on my arm, and I would just not. I understood that. I hated that I understood it, but I did. You have to tell them," I said. "Not because they deserve to be angry at you, although they might be for a while, but because you've been carrying this alone for a very long time, and I watched you at Thanksgiving, and I don't think you're okay." He didn't argue with me. I did not tell my parents for him. I had considered it and decided it wasn't mine to do. I told him he had 2 weeks, and I told him I would be there when he did it, and I told him that whatever happened after, I was not going to pretend I didn't know. He said he understood. He told them on a Sunday afternoon in December, over the phone first and then in person a week later when he drove up. I don't know exactly what was said in that first call because I wasn't there, and he didn't tell me the details. Only that it had been hard and that my mother had cried and that my father had been very quiet for a long time before he spoke. I was there for the second conversation, the in-person one. My brother sat at the kitchen table where we had sat for every holiday of our lives, and he told the whole thing from the beginning, carefully, without softening it or dramatizing it. And my parents listened. My mother cried again. My father did not say much for a long time. What he finally said was, "Why didn't you think we could handle it?" And my brother looked at him for a long moment and said, "I didn't think you could handle being wrong about me." My father was quiet after that. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over my brother's hand. Outside, it was cold and gray, the particular gray of December in the mid-Atlantic, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something it would never catch. "We were wrong about a lot of things," my father said eventually. "That doesn't mean you were one of them." My brother looked like something had come loose in him. Not broken loose. The way a knot releases. It was not a perfect conversation. It did not resolve everything in an afternoon. My mother asked questions that he couldn't fully answer. My father said something at one point that came out harder than he probably intended. Something about the money years of tuition they hadn't paid because my brother had scholarships, but still, years of the story. Years of phone calls, and there was a sharp silence after it, and then my mother put her hand on my father's arm, and my father nodded, and that was that. There was more to work through. There would be more conversations, more questions, more moments where the weight of all those years made itself felt. That was real. I don't want to pretend the afternoon ended in something clean, but my brother drove home that night without the thing he had been carrying, or at least without all of it. He texted me when he got back to Phoenix. He said, "It's done." I said, "I know." He said, "Thank you." I said, "You don't have to thank me." He said, "I do actually." My husband asked me that evening how it had gone. I told him what I remembered of it, the parts I had witnessed. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without filling the space. When I finished, he said, "Do you think he's going to be okay?" I thought about my brother at that kitchen table. I thought about his face when my father said what he said about being wrong. I thought about the not releasing. "I think he has a chance to be," I said. "I think that's actually the most any of us gets." My husband put his arm around me and didn't say anything else, and that was the right thing. The exactly right thing. And I thought about how strange and specific it was to love someone who knew when to stop talking. There's something I've thought about a lot since then. Not about my brother. Exactly about the cost of a particular kind of silence. The silence that starts as protection and stays as habit. The silence that isn't cruelty but accumulates like it. I have thought about how many people I know are carrying some version of a story that no longer matches the life they are actually living, and how much of their energy goes into the maintenance of it, into keeping the two things from colliding. My brother is doing well now. That is not a small thing to say. He is still in Phoenix. He is still in logistics. He called me in March to tell me that he had started volunteering at a free clinic on weekends, not as a physician, just as a coordinator, managing intake and scheduling, and that he liked it more than he had liked anything in years. He sounded different on the phone. Not lighter, exactly. More like himself, whatever that meant now that I was hearing it without the other thing underneath. My parents have adjusted, which is also not a small thing. My mother still talks about him when she runs into people from her church, but which she says has changed. She says he works in healthcare operations. She says he volunteers. She sounds, when she says these things, like someone who is figuring out a new language and finding that it fits well enough. My father has not said much about it since December. That is its own kind of working through. He is not a man who processes things quickly or out loud, and I have come to understand that his silence is not indifference. It is what his love looks like when it is doing hard work. I think about what my husband said the night before I called my brother. He said, "I want to be wrong." He had said it quietly, without drama, because he meant it. He had not been hoping to find something. He had been hoping not to. That is, I think, the right way to go looking for truth. Not with any appetite for what you might find, but with the understanding that not knowing is also a cost. And sometimes the cost of not knowing is paid by the people you love most. I set the table for Christmas that year. My mother made her sweet potatoes, brown sugar, and maple syrup, both because she still could not decide. My brother drove up from Philadelphia, made good time, came through the door, and my mother made that noise when he hugged her. My father shook his hand and then pulled him in anyway. My husband was at the counter slicing bread. He looked up when my brother walked in, and my brother looked at him, and something passed between them. Not words, not warmth exactly. More like acknowledgement. Two people who understood something about the weight of things. Then my brother set his jacket over the back of a chair and he started telling a story about the drive, and everyone laughed, and the kitchen smelled like sweet potatoes and rosemary, and dinner would be ready in 40 minutes. This time, everything was exactly what it looked like. I keep coming back to the moment my brother said he kept thinking he'd go back. That for the first 2 years, he genuinely believed it. That somewhere along the way, the intention became maintenance, and he stopped asking himself what he actually wanted and started asking himself only how to keep the surface intact. I don't think he was a dishonest person. I think he was a person who made one dishonest choice under enormous pressure and then lived inside the consequences of that choice for so long that he forgot there had ever been a door out. That is not the same thing, but it is also not nothing. What my husband did, the way he moved through what he noticed, carefully without appetite for being right, that is its own kind of lesson for me. He could have said nothing. He could have decided it wasn't his place, that families have their arrangements and it isn't always wise to look too hard at them. A lot of people would have made that choice and called it kindness. But he understood that real honesty isn't cruelty, and real kindness isn't silence. He had the clarity to see the difference and the patience to sit with what he saw before acting on it. That kind of discernment, knowing not just what is true, but what to do with the truth, is something I have been trying to learn from him ever since. My brother carried something alone for 10 years because he believed the people who loved him could not hold the real version of him. And the saddest part isn't that he was wrong. The saddest part is that he spent a decade not finding out. The courage it would have taken to tell the truth in year 1 was real. I'm not pretending it wasn't. But it was smaller than the courage it took in year 10, and smaller still than the weight he carried in the years between. That is how it works, I think. The thing you don't face doesn't stay the same size. It grows in the dark. What my father said at that kitchen table in December, "Why didn't you think we could handle it?" has stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. Because the answer my brother gave was honest. He wasn't afraid they couldn't handle the failure. He was afraid they couldn't handle being wrong about him. And there is something in that distinction that I think a lot of families never examine. The pressure we place on the people we love most is rarely meant as pressure. It comes from pride, from hope, from the very real desire to see someone we believe in become what we believe they're capable of. But received on the other end, without room to say I'm struggling or this isn't right for me, it can become a wall instead of a door. I think about who my brother might have become if the first conversation had happened at year 1 instead of year 10. Not a different person. Him, but without the decade of weight. With the energy he spent maintaining a story redirected into building an actual life. He is doing that now. It is not too late. But those years were real and they cost something and they didn't have to. The thing I hold on to is this. The truth, when it finally came, did not destroy anything that deserved to survive. My parents are still my parents. My brother is still my brother. What changed is that we are all, finally, in the same room with the same version of things. That is not a small thing. That is, maybe, the whole thing.